In 1700 BC, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the most enthralling and enduring creation myths, the following was engraved into a timeless tablet: "Hold my hand in yours, and we will not fear what hands like ours can do." They invented our modern calendar. We still use their system of time-telling. In fact, the reason we have the 360-degree system to measure angles is because of them. They are even said to have invented the wheel. But who were the original Sumerians? What does the evidence show on where these amazing inventors come from? As we shall see, our modern perception of who the original Sumerians were is skewed. History is not a burden on the memory, but an illumination on the soul. Claimed as a distinctively Asiatic civilization, Sumer is spread across western Asia Minor, just a northern stone throw away from ancient Egypt. The archaeological and genetic data, however, paints a picture of a people with a drastically different origin than the people who live there today. The Sumerians were the early high culture in the Levant. They spanned from the Ubaid period in 5000 BCE to the kingdom of Ur in 17th century BCE. It is only in the latter periods of the Sumerian civilization, the Gutian and Ur periods, that chaos and decline became rampant. As Guti barbarians defeated the Akkadian military, but were unable to support the civilizations in place. But it is only natural that this period of the world sees the development of one of the first civilizations in the world, because some 6,000 years earlier, it is in that same region that agriculture was developed, and this has significance in our topic, and we will revisit it later in the video. We have a lot of evidence that tells us where the original Sumerians came from. Archaeological evidence, cranial and osteological evidence, theological evidence, pictorial evidence, cultural evidence. However, it is interesting to observe that today people of African descent are being accused of trying to appropriate themselves with other people's culture because of ancient Egypt, and yet the evidence shows that in fact it is others who have inherited for themselves civilizations that were African, from Mesopotamia to Carthage. And today we will go over the evidence that shows who the true initiators of civilization in the Levant were, who kick-started the long series of innovations that ultimately culminated in the world we see today. From Sargon of Akkad to Hannibal, let's go. Let's demystify the origins of ancient Sumer. I am a strong subscriber to the value for value model. If you feel that this channel has brought you and your loved ones some value, I would be immensely grateful if you would consider returning that value in any way you can, either in the form of subscriptions to the channel or Patreon, or through sharing it with others so we can get the word out. I particularly want to thank Dwayne Burlap for his consequential contributions. He is one of the many heroes that will help the next generation find a base of knowledge and psychological strength on which they can build a better future. A more optimistic future for not just the Afro-descendants, but for the world at large. Make no mistake about it. The answer is history. True history. Before we review the abundance of the evidence on the spring of Sumer, it is crucial that we go over the dishonesty of some influential early researchers in the field, and how some have kept the truth from those who do not have enough time to dig deep into the evidence of the true beginnings of Sumer. Researchers such as Dr. Julius Oppert, the late 19th century Orientalist, who actively concealed the truth clearly laid by the evidence he uncovered. But in the same line, we also want to highlight the effort of those researchers who have exposed themselves and risked reputation and career to make sure the truth is known. Oppert began to popularize the idea that the Sumerians were related to the contemporary Altaic and Turanian-speaking people, for example, Turks and Magyar, Hungarian-speaking people. He forwarded the notion that the Akkadians were Eurasians like himself. To support this idea, Oppert pointed out that typological features between Sumerian and Altaic languages existed. This feature was agglutination. The problem with identifying the Sumerians as descendants from contemporary Turanian speakers resulted from the fact that Sumerian and the Turkish languages are not genetically related. As a result, Oppert began to criticize the work of Hincks, who was dead at the time, in relation to the identification of the Sumerian people as Turanian, following the research of Rawlinson. It is strange to some observers that Oppert never criticized Rawlinson, in many ways the father of Assyriology, who had proposed the Turanian origin of the Kianji Sumerians. But this was not strange at all. Oppert did not attack Rawlinson, who was still alive at the time, because he knew that Rawlinson said the Sumerians were the original Scythic and Turanian people he called Kushites. Moreover, Rawlinson made it clear that both the Akkadians and Sumerians were blacks. For Oppert to have debated this issue with Rawlinson, who deciphered the cuneiform script, would have meant that he would have had to accept the fact that Semites were black. There was no way Oppert would have wanted to acknowledge his African heritage. Because of the evidence that was continuously being uncovered, it was becoming more and more difficult to keep these conclusions from researchers who read the original Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian text, that these people recognized that they were ethnically blacks. Notice here a theme where both the Africans from the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex and the Africans in the Levant always made sure to distinguish themselves from surrounding peoples in the appellation of their people and their land, Kemet and Sagigga. This fact was made clear by Albert Terrien de la Couperie. Born in France, de la Couperie was a well-known linguist and China expert. Although native of France, most of his writings are in English. In the journal he published called The Babylonian and Oriental Record, he outlined many aspects of ancient history. In these pages he made it clear that the Sumerians, Akkadians, and even the Assyrians, who called themselves Salmat Kakadi black-headed people, were all blacks of Kushite origin. Even though de la Couperie taught at the University of London, the prestige of Oppert and the fact that the main centers for Sumero-Akkadian studies in France and Germany were founded by Oppert and his students led to researchers ignoring the evidence that the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Assyrians were black, or worse, promoting a skewed idea of history. This in the least constitutes intellectual dishonesty, and in the worst something far pernicious that bears not repeating. In summary, the cuneiform evidence makes it clear that the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Assyrians recognized themselves as black Afro-descendants, blackheads. This fact was supported by multiple dimensions of data, as we shall see throughout this video. Little-known facts like the Behistun monument, which made it clear that the Elamites were also blacks. The textual evidence also makes it clear that Oppert began the discussion of a typological relationship between Sumerian and Turkic languages. He also manufactured the idea that the Semites of Mesopotamia and Iran, the Assyrians and Akkadians, were Caucasians, like himself. Due to this, many people today can look at depictions of Assyrians, Achaemenians, and Akkadians and fail to see the Negro origin of these people. To make the Sumerians Europeans, textbooks print pictures of artifacts dating to the Gutian rule of Lagash, to pass them off as the true originators of Sumerian civilization. No Gutian rulers of Lagash are recognized in the Sumerian king list. Notice here that the Gutians seem to have only briefly overrun Elam, and were not of the same stock as mainstream Sumerians. Perhaps best said by the great 19th century American anthropologist John D. Baldwin, and I quote, "It is now admitted that a people of the Kushite or Ethiopian race, sometimes called Hamites, were the first civilizers and builders throughout Western Asia, and they are traced by the remains of their language, their architecture, and the influence of their civilization on both shores of the Mediterranean, in eastern Africa and the Nile Valley, in Hindustan, and in the islands of the Indian Seas." End quote. But the evidence shows up prominently in ancient Sumerian art too, especially the artifacts that are seldom shared. One of the most notable of these ancient reliefs is the victory stele of Naram Sin, the third Akkadian king. According to Dr. Wesley Muhammad, the stele depicts Naram Sin's military victory over a Negrito people in the Zagros Mountains plain of Iran. This, along with the Narmer palette, are amongst my all-time favorite steles. Admire already the refined details on this sculpture. Notice the ornate attire of Naram Sin, his scepter and bow. Of particular interest, we notice how the people of Zagros sport typical Afros and Afro phenotypes. So not only the Akkadian were black African, but the surrounding people were also phenotypically African. Further data will reinforce this later in the video. In The Negro in the New World, Sir Harry Hamilton Johnston writes, "The Elamites of Mesopotamia appear to have been a Negroid people with kinky hair, and to have transmitted this racial type to the Jews and Syrians. There is a curliness of the hair, together with a Negro eye and full lips, in the portraiture of Assyria, which conveys the idea of an evident Negro element in Babylonia." Another telling revelation from anthropologists report that, quote, "there was a distinct Negrito presence at the earliest levels. Both Dieulafoy and de Morgan believed that there was a very ancient occupation of the Susian plain by Negritos, who were probably the original inhabitants. Negritos do appear on ancient bas reliefs. Dark populations are found in Bashagird and Sarhad, Baluchistan. That country was originally peopled by Negritos, the Anarikoi, or non-Aryans of the Greeks, who probably stretched along the northern shores of the Persian Gulf to India." End quote. To put this into context, this assertion was made by Jane Dieulafoy, the famous cross-dressing 19th century anthropologist who made significant discoveries in Mesopotamia. Here I would like to pause to make an important comment on the rising nature of black people calling themselves modern Jews. It bears repeating that the events that we are talking about happened well over 5,000 years ago. And during this time, not only have these kingdoms crumbled, but other people have inherited and modified the original Hebrew and Assyrian culture into something completely new. And it would be wrong to appropriate ourselves with this new culture in the same way that it is wrong for modern Semite to appropriate themselves with the culture of ancient Egypt. It is important to know where we came from and what our ancestors were capable of. That, coupled with our undying ingenuity, will drive us to rebuild our communities and countries. Before Mesopotamia established itself as a civilization, the region was civilized by a people to whom modern civilization owes everything. The Natufians. The underpinnings of any successful civilization is population. And population needs food. This is why agriculture has ushered in an era of almost unbroken civilization growth for humans. And we have the Natufians to thank for this. The Natufians mainly lived in the Levant, from the Taurus Mountains in Turkey to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. But most notably, they are the first to practice agriculture around 13,000 BC. Natufians were the first to sedentarize, but also the first to establish politics. One of the surprising facts coming out of the studies of Natufians is that there are more and more indications that Göbekli Tepe and similar sites have been built by the Natufians. Researcher Dr. Dorothy Garrett attests that the Natufians, who were living in the Middle East since 13,000 BC, would have been behind the construction of Göbekli Tepe, soon after the Holocene period began. Although more research on this subject needs to be done, it stands to reason that the Natufians would have had the agricultural backing and specialization sophistication necessary to build the sites. Skeletal remains of those practicing the Natufian culture date from the transition from the Neolithic to the Paleolithic. The Natufians were of medium stature. Their skulls were also dolichocephalic, with broad, short faces and a tendency towards prognathism. This was clarified in the book Paleopathology and the Origins of Agriculture by Mark Nathan Cohen and George G. Amelagus. Both dolichocephaly and prognathism are key traits of African populations. Dr. Iosef Lizaridis and Dr. Nadine Rowland from Harvard performed extensive genetic tests on Natufian archaeological remains, and this is what they found. Natufians had clear African DNA markers, without any Neanderthal admixture. What does this mean? It means that the Natufians who lived in the Levant, that same area where the Sumerian emerged, the discoverers of agriculture, were black African. We have already seen in previous episodes how those same Natufians, millennia after, migrated and merged with surrounding populations to spread agriculture deep into the African continent and in Europe and Asia. This is yet another indicator that well before the Akkadians and the Sumerians came into the picture, Africans were already well established into the region, developing the underpinnings of what subsequent civilizations were built on. One of the many concepts that we have repeated in our channel is that if a theory is true, it shouldn't be hard to find evidence to support it, especially in the field of history. By way of illustration, if the Nubio-Kemetic civilization had originated in the Levant or in Europe, then it would not be hard to find evidence predating ancient Egypt in Europe or in Asia Minor. And yet it is deeper and deeper in the continent of Africa that we find the cultural, religious, and genetic source for that civilization. And the same goes for cranium classification of pre-dynastic and early dynastic period in Mesopotamia, Kish period. The ancient city of Kish was occupied from at least as early as 3200 BC through the 7th century AD, located on the floodplain of the Euphrates River, 80 kilometers south of modern Baghdad. Kish held an extraordinary position during the formative periods of Mesopotamian history. At that time, it seems to have been the only important city in the northern part of the alluvium, while there were several major centers in the south. The ancient Mesopotamians regarded Kish as the first city to which kingship descended from heaven after the great flood that had destroyed the world. During the 3rd millennium BC, rule over Kish implied dominance over the entire northern part of the plain, and the title King of Kish bestowed prestige analogous to that of the medieval Holy Roman Emperor. The British Museum of Natural History holds the largest collection of Kish remains. These were analyzed and classified by anthropologist Faris Supia using Fordisk 2.0 to determine the affinities of the individuals and the population as a whole. Fordisk 2.0, the forensic discriminant program, enables precise classification of the ethnic origin given a cranial sample. Notice here that the reading of Egyptian refers to the Nubio-Kemetic stocks, which we have already seen is indistinguishable from Africans living south of the Sahara. Same goes for other non-Eurasian classifications that are directly attributable to Africans, and it shows clearly that the predominant associations were African, as you can see on the summary table of the analysis. Furthermore, consistent with the previous data, the presence of non-African stock starts to increase only in the late period. This shows that just like in the ancient Nubio-Kemet, millennia after the Africans had established the civilization, along with all its defining elements, surrounding people not only started to immigrate to Kish and the rest of Mesopotamia, but invaders also brought in new people who over centuries inherited the science, culture, and land of the Kishites, Babylonians, and Akkadians. But if indeed Sumer was seeded by Africans, then there must be a verifiable linguistic trail that we can follow all the way back to Proto-African languages. In an interview with Acer Hotep, Hermel Hermstein breaks down the linguistic roots of Sumerian, which happen to be firmly within the African language family, especially the Bantu language family.
He had been expecting to find that there wouldn't be as much as he found. And then the next thing he did is he compared with non-Niger Congo languages. And so he came to the conclusion that these ones must be further off if there's any relationship at all. And then he compared Proto-Bantu with Sumerian, and then his conclusion was Sumerian, therefore is a Niger Congo language. And so I did a lot of searching, and I found, in the end, I found something like between 115 and 125, somewhere there in that region.
The languages spoken in ancient Mesopotamia and the Levant have changed over time. The first people to dominate the area were the Sumerians. The language spoken by the Sumerians was adopted by the nomadic people living in the area, especially the Gutians. The Sumerians were conquered by the Akkadians. They spoke a Semitic language. The linguistic evidence makes it clear that the Akkadians originated in the Sudan, migrated across East Africa into Arabia, and replaced the Sumerians as the dominant group in Mesopotamia. The Gutians, once the Akkadians took over the region, replaced Sumerian with the Semitic language spoken by the Akkadians. Since Akkadian times, Semitic has been the dominant language in Mesopotamia. Another group of Semitic speakers settled the Levant. These people were a great naval power called the Canaanites and Phoenicians. The linguistic evidence makes it clear that the Akkadians originated in Africa. According to Haupt, in 1878, Akkadian, Minoan, and Ethiopic all belong to the same group of Semitic languages, even though they are separated in time and by great geographical distance. This is surprising considering the fact that Ethiopic and Akkadian are separated by many hundreds of years. The best example of this unity is the presence of shared archaism. The linguistic feature of shared archaism is the appearance of the vowel after the first consonant of the imperfect. For example, one of the most outstanding features of Ethiopian Semitic languages is the presence of a vowel following the first consonant in the verb form known as the imperfect, for example, yi kwatul, using the hypothetical verb consonants qtl, yi is the person marking prefix, or yi ketel he kills. In Southwest Semitic, the form of the perfect is yu kutul yu. Here we have the same hypothetical qtl form, but there is no vowel following the first consonant of the verb root. It is common in non-African languages to form words with two consonants. African languages usually have a vowel separating each consonant in a word, for example, unasema Kiswahili, can you speak Swahili? The fact that Akkadian has shared archaism with Ethiopian Semitic languages shows that at the time the Akkadians and Ethiopic speakers separated these groups had dialectical unity. The lack of this trait in Arabic and Hebrew shows that they have been influenced by the Indo-European speakers who invaded Palestine and Arabia between 1300 BC and 900 BC. This is important, as it negates the often touted argument that Sumer was seeded by a non-African Asiatic type. In fact, we can now start to get a sense of the African presence from 13,000 BC when the Natufians ushered in agriculture, bread, and beer, and that presence was sustained, thanks to agriculture and sedentarization, all the way until 6,500 BC, at the start of the Ubaid period. It's in the Ubaid culture period, 6,500 BC to 4,100 BC, that we see the first settlement in southern Mesopotamia by farmers who brought irrigation agriculture and the distinctive and finely painted pottery, very reminiscent of the pre-dynastic period in the Nubio-Kemetic civilization. It is also in that period that the Africans initiated the first use of the sailboat. The small, masted Mesopotamian boats are believed to have facilitated minor, but significant long-distance trade between the emerging villages of the Fertile Crescent and the Arabian Neolithic communities of the Persian Gulf. Boatmen followed the Tigris and Euphrates rivers down into the Persian Gulf and along the coasts of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Qatar. But in the following epoch, there is one invention from the Sumerians that is so consequential that it has been used as a way to diminish those who were originally thought to not have it. In the Uruk period, we start to see several cultural and architectural transitions. First, pottery began to be mass-produced. Second, trade goods began to flow down waterways in southern Mesopotamia, and large temple-centered cities, most likely theocratic and run by priests-kings, rose up to facilitate this trade. Slave labor was also utilized. More importantly, it is in this period that the wheel was first invented. And as we have seen, the whole region was inhabited by and ruled by black Africans. So next time someone tries to use the invention of the wheel as a pejorative towards Africans, it would be useful to educate them on who the true inventors of the wheel were. The early dynastic period, which lasted from 2900 BC to 2334 BCE, saw the advent of Mesopotamian writing, in contrast to pictograms, become commonplace and decipherable. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions several leaders, including Gilgamesh himself, who were likely historical kings. The first dynastic king was Etana, the 13th king of the first dynasty of Kish. War was on the increase, and cities erected walls for self-preservation. Sumerian culture began to spread from southern Mesopotamia into surrounding areas. During the Akkadian Empire period from 2334 BC to 2218 BC, many in the region became bilingual in both Sumerian and Akkadian. Toward the end of the empire, though, Sumerian became increasingly a literary language. It is only in the latter periods of the Sumerian civilization, the Gutian and Ur periods, that chaos and decline became rampant. As Guti barbarians defeated the Akkadian military, but were unable to support the civilizations in place. In addition to osteology, cultural evidence, pictorial evidence, and linguistic evidence, we also find supporting indexes that Sumerian religion is nothing more than a derivative of ancient traditional African religion. In his book, The African Origins of Civilization, Dr. Diop again shows that even Islamic cultural and religious origin was African. The Jektonides, who at the time of their arrival were still little more than barbarians, introduced nothing but a system of pastoral tribes and military feudalism, cf. Lenormand, p. 385. The religion was of Kushite origin and seemed to emanate directly from the Babylonian cult. It would remain the same until the advent of Islam. The Sabaean gods were just about the same as the Babylonian gods, and all belonged to the same Kushite family of Egyptian and Phoenician deities. The only triad revered was Venus, Sun, Moon, as in Babylon. The cult had a pronounced sidereal character, especially solar. They prayed to the sun at different phases of its course. There was neither idolatry, nor images, nor priesthood. They addressed a direct invocation to the 7 planets. The 30-day fasting period already existed, as in Egypt. They prayed 7 times each day, with their faces turned toward the north. These prayers to the sun at different hours somewhat resemble Muslim prayers which take place during the same phases, but which have been reduced by the Prophet to 5 compulsory prayers to relieve humanity. The other 2 prayers are optional. There were also sacred springs and stones, as in Muslim times. Zenzen, a sacred spring, Kaaba, a sacred stone. The pilgrimage to Mecca already existed. The Kaaba was reputed to have been constructed by Ishmael, son of Abraham and Hagar the Egyptian, a Negro woman, historical ancestor of Muhammad, according to all Arab historians. As in Egypt, belief in a future life was already prevalent. Dead ancestors were deified. Thus, all the elements necessary for the blossoming of Islam were in place more than 1,000 years before the birth of Muhammad. Islam would appear as a purification of Sabaeanism by the messenger of God. So we have seen that the entire Arab people, including the Prophet, is mixed with Negro blood. All educated Arabs are conscious of that fact. The fabulous hero of Arabia, Antar, is himself a mixed breed. But this is not all. We know that Egyptian religion and their original gods not only came from the south, from Nubia, but we have already seen in our previous documentary how Sumerians' deities are derived from the Kemetic gods. This goes beyond similarities, as gods like Anu, Enlil, Inanna all derive from ATR, African traditional religion. Because of the racialization and weaponization of history, especially against the African, bringing forward such facts is now tantamount to heresy, and yet, if anything, it shows that all people had a significant role to play in the modernization of the world, a true demonstration of the human potential, wherever it is present. Alas, many rather subscribe to the false notions of racial hierarchy established in the 17th and 18th century, notions that are easily overturned by changes in economic fortune, as the Chinese have demonstrated over the last 5 decades. Dr. Diop in his work was careful to outline the exaggerations that occur when historians try to elevate Mesopotamia, and he lays it out in this manner. Egypt's pyramids, temples, and obelisks, its abundance of columns at Luxor and Karnak, its avenues of sphinxes, the colossi of Memnon, its rock carvings, its underground temples with proto-Doric columns, Deir el-Bahari at Thebes, are an architectural reality still palpable today, historical evidence that no dogma can blow into thin air. In contrast, what did Iran, Elam, and Mesopotamia produce prior to the 8th century, epoch of the Assyrians? Only shapeless clay mounds. These mounds have been heralded as ruins of crumbling temples and towers that it is hoped to restore. Thus, a British archaeologist, Seton Lloyd, is restoring the interior of a hypothetical Babylonian temple of the 2nd or 3rd millennium, reproduced by Breasted. This restoration is to be carried out with excavations undertaken by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. Such restorations, including that of the Tower of Babel, are extremely serious for the history of mankind because of the illusion they can create. The remains of these Babylonian tower buildings are very scanty, and there has been much difference of opinion regarding the proper form of restoration. Evidence from late contemporaries, according to quatrophages and Hami the Negroid type, which occurs in Assyrian reliefs, represents the primitive element of Susiana, whose inhabitants are probably a mixture of Kuchiti and Negro. The nose is relatively flat with dilated nares, the molars prominent, the lips thick, conforming to a well-known type. If you are still here listening, you are a true lover of history. Make sure you point out the 2 facts that you found particularly interesting. This channel cannot exist without the continuous support of our members on Patreon and YouTube. As you see on the screen the names of those who have contributed so far, I want to encourage you to support us by buying us the equivalent of a cup of coffee. This helps in the research, writing, and editing that goes into each one of these videos. Lastly, I want to make clear that I do not subscribe to any racial superiority theories, neither Asiatic, European, nor African. If anything, my long study into this most amazing of sciences we call history, that the Kemetu called Medu, roughly translating to records or chronicles, this amazing science has shown that all people, given the right conditions, can build the most amazing of civilizations. As a parting gift, I would like to leave you with this summarized version of the Enuma Elish, but this time I want you to listen to it while substituting the heavenly gods by beings who had advanced knowledge and technology compared to the Sumerians at the time, a people who seeded that civilization and enslaved the inhabitants of the region to serve as the basis for their economic engine, a people whose king became ancestors venerated as gods, a people who came from a land that was seen as higher in symbolic terms than the Sumerians. These colonists were none other than the African stock from the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex, a true tale of a people who migrated from Africa, established and civilized the Levant, and demanded independence from their former colonial masters, an allegory to modern-day birthing of many nations. The story begins with the existence of two primordial gods, Apsu, the god of fresh waters, and Tiamat, the goddess of the saltwater ocean. They produce a younger generation of gods, who are noisy and disruptive. Annoyed by this, Apsu plans to destroy them, but his plot is discovered. Ea, Enki, one of the younger gods, incapacitates and kills Apsu. Tiamat is enraged and creates a host of monsters, led by her new consort Kingu, to wage war against the younger gods. Ea and his spouse Damkina give birth to Marduk, an exceptionally powerful god with 4 eyes and 4 ears. He volunteers to fight Tiamat on the condition that if he emerges victorious, he will be made the supreme god. The younger gods agree to Marduk's terms and provide him with powerful winds and weapons. Marduk confronts Tiamat in an epic battle and kills her by trapping her with a net, blowing her up with the winds and then shooting an arrow that splits her in 2. He then uses Tiamat's body to create the heavens and the earth. One half becomes the sky and the other the earth. Marduk also captures and punishes Kingu, using his blood to create humans, who are to serve the gods and relieve them of their labor. Finally, Marduk is proclaimed the supreme god and takes his place in a newly built temple in Babylon. The gods gather to sing his praises and enumerate his 50 names, each describing a different aspect or power. Don't miss our previous videos where we explore the true cradle of civilization. We also covered the greatest civilization in history. This is an episode you do not want to miss, as review how Africans were at the pillar of the longest-lasting civilization in history and how it spread technology and know-how all over the globe. And if you like historical documentaries, we also covered the true African origins of mathematics. And if you haven't seen it, there are a few gems in this one. Join us and see how those who are said to be without history birthed civilization itself.
Yes, the hour is dark. Evil comes forth in the guise of good. It is a time of double talk, when men in high places have a high blood pressure of deceptive rhetoric and an anemia of concrete performance. What they truly advocate is socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor.
Join us and see how those who are said to be without history birthed civilization itself.